Hey there, fellow deep divers. Have you ever just felt like the world's getting scarier? Like every time you turn on the news or scroll through social media, there's like another reason to be afraid.
It does kind of feel that way sometimes, right?
Yeah, and you know what fuels that fire?
What's that?
True crime. But here's the thing, only 4% of true crime content focuses on serial killers.
Yep, that's kind of what we tend to think of, right? Like our brains are just wired to fixate on those extreme cases, the stuff of nightmares.
Yeah.
But what if that's actually making us less safe by distorting our view of the real threats out there?
Huh. You know, it's like looking at the world through a funhouse mirror. The reflection's all distorted and exaggerated, but it's hard to see past that image. And when it comes to true crime, that distortion can have real-world consequences.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to kind of unpack today, the psychological impact of true crime, especially for those of us who grew up with it as this big cultural force. We'll be drawing insights from an incredible interview with author Emma Berquist on the You're Wrong About podcast. Oh yeah, I love that show.
Oh, it's so good. And Emma's perspective is especially powerful because she's a survivor of a random violent attack.
Wow.
She's lived through that kind of nightmare scenario that true crime often portrays. And she has a lot to say about how this genre shapes our fear of the world.
I can
Really?
imagine. One of the most interesting things Emma points out is how true crime has evolved. From this guilty pleasure, something you'd hide under the covers with a flashlight to read, to this mainstream, almost prestigious genre. Now we have book clubs dedicated to true crime, documentaries winning awards, podcasts topping the charts. It's become so normal that you almost feel like you have to defend your interest in it.
Yeah, I've totally felt that pressure. Like, oh, I'm not just morbidly curious. I'm actually fascinated by the psychology of it all.
Right.
But Emma argues that it's okay to just enjoy it for what it is. We don't have to intellectualize everything.
Exactly. It's entertainment, and there's nothing wrong with finding entertainment in the darker aspects of human nature. But what's important is to be aware of how that entertainment might be shaping our perceptions, because the line between reality and fiction can get blurry, especially with true crime.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Because on one hand, true crime can be a way of coping with the anxieties of the real world. In a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable, these stories offer a sense of control. You know the bad guy will be caught. Justice will be served. It's almost comforting in a strange way.
Yeah, and that's a perfectly natural human response. We crave order, we crave resolution, and true crime often provides that in a very neat, satisfying package.
But as Emma points out, there's a danger in that desire for control, because it can easily lead to victim blaming. We start thinking, well, if I had done this differently or avoided that situation, I wouldn't have become a victim. It's a way of creating this false sense of security, of convincing ourselves that we're somehow immune to the dangers out there.
And that kind of thinking can be incredibly dangerous because it prevents us from seeing the bigger picture, the systemic issues that contribute to these tragedies. It's like focusing on a single tree in the forest and ignoring the fact that the whole forest is on fire.
Yeah, it's like we're imposing these artificial narratives onto real-life events.
Mhm.
We want that clear beginning, middle, and end, a neat resolution.
Yeah.
But real life just isn't like that.
Right. And this is where the narrative trap comes in. True crime often presents these complex situations as simple stories with clear-cut heroes and villains. And while that can be entertaining, it doesn't reflect the messy, nuanced reality of crime and human behavior.
And it also distracts us from the real issues. Instead of tackling systemic problems like poverty, inequality, or lack of mental health resources, we're obsessing over individual cases, trying to find a single, easy-to-digest explanation for why these terrible things happen.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to process, right, when you can condense it down like that.
Right. Yeah, I totally get it.
Emma actually talks about her own experience after the attack, how she became fixated on finding the why.
Like, why me? Why then?
Exactly. But there wasn't a satisfying answer, and that was hard to accept.
That must have been so difficult, to go through something so traumatic and then just feel like there's no rhyme or reason to it, no way to make sense of it all.
And it reflects a broader issue with how we consume true crime. We want these neat explanations, these easy-to-understand motives. But human behavior is far more complex than that. And the more we try to fit these complex events into simplistic narratives, the further we get from understanding the real roots of the problem.
So we're drawn to these stranger danger narratives, the idea of the boogeyman lurking in the shadows. But is that really where the threat lies? Emma argues that this focus actually erodes our sense of community, making us suspicious of everyone around us.
Makes sense. Think about it. If we're constantly looking for the bad guy, We miss out on all the good, all the everyday acts of kindness and connection that make up a community. We become isolated, fearful, and less likely to reach out to others.
It's almost like we're trading genuine human connection for this heightened sense of anxiety and suspicion. And that, in a way, makes us even more vulnerable.
Exactly. And this plays into our cultural discomfort with death. You know, in a society that avoids talking about mortality, true crime offers a way to engage with death, but at a safe distance. We can explore the dark side of humanity, the ultimate taboo, without having to directly confront our own mortality.
So we have morbid curiosity, but also a way of grappling with the fact that we're all going to die someday.
Exactly. It's a fascinating paradox. We're both repulsed and fascinated by death, and true crime, in its own way, lets us explore those feelings in a controlled environment.
But here's the thing. Emma challenges us to think about what true crime could be. What if it moved beyond these sensationalized murders and explored a wider range of crimes? Crimes that impact our daily lives in a very real way.
Ooh, I like
Okay.
that. So like, and instead of just focusing on, like the serial killer stuff,
Yeah.
we could look at like, I don't know, maybe corporate greed or environmental destruction, systemic racism. These are issues that truly affect our communities, but they rarely get the same attention as the more sensationalized crimes.
Right. It's about reclaiming the genre, using it to spark critical thinking and empathy, rather than just fear and paranoia.
Exactly. And that requires a shift in how we consume this content. We need to be more critical, more aware of our own biases, and how the narrative might be manipulating our emotions.
So before we get too deep into that, let's step back for a minute and talk about some of the specific examples Emma brings up. She talks about how the rise of true crime podcasts, with their prestige status, has really changed the game.
You know, it's fascinating how the format itself has changed the experience. Podcasts create this intimate, almost conversational feeling. You're listening to these stories through headphones, often alone, and it can really blur the lines between entertainment and reality.
Right. It's not just a TV show playing in the background anymore. It feels much more personal, more immersive. And Emma points out how podcasts, with their episodic structure, further reinforce that narrative trap we were talking about. Each episode becomes a self-contained story with a beginning, middle, and end.
And that can be dangerous when dealing with complex, real-life situations
Yeah.
because it creates this illusion of resolution,
Yeah.
of closure, when in reality the impacts of these crimes ripple outwards for years, even generations. It's not as simple as wrapping everything up in a neat little bow at the end of the episode.
She also brings up a really disturbing trend she's noticed.
Yeah.
This idea that if only the victim had consumed more true crime, they could have somehow prevented their own fate. It's like victim blaming disguised as self-help.
Yeah, that's scary. It's a chilling example of how this genre can distort our perception of risk and responsibility. It's not about empowering people with knowledge, it's about shifting blame onto the victim, as if they somehow failed to adequately prepare for the worst-case scenario.
And speaking of distorted perceptions, Emma talks about the whole stranger danger myth and how it's been amplified by true crime. We're constantly bombarded with stories about predators lurking in the shadows, waiting to snatch unsuspecting victims.
And that fear, as Emma argues, can actually make us less safe. Because if we're constantly on high alert, distrusting everyone we encounter, we isolate ourselves and weaken the very community bonds that are so vital for our well-being.
It's a vicious cycle. The more we consume this content, the more fearful and isolated we become, and the less equipped we are to deal with real-life risks and challenges. And it distracts us from the fact that statistically, the vast majority of violence occurs within existing relationships, not at the hands of strangers.
It's like we're so focused on the boogeyman in the closet that we forget to check under the bed. We're looking for danger in all the wrong places.
And she makes this fascinating connection to the rise of Ring doorbell cameras and other surveillance tech. It's like the marketing preys on our anxieties, convincing us that we need constant monitoring to be safe. But is that really creating a safer environment, or is it just feeding into our paranoia?
That's a good question to ask ourselves. Because the more we retreat into our fortified homes, viewing the outside world as inherently threatening, the less likely we are to engage with our communities, to build those relationships that create a truly safe and supportive environment.
She actually shares a personal experience that really drives this point home. After she survived the attack, it was a stranger who came to her aid, who called the police and stayed with her until help arrived. It's a powerful reminder that for every act of violence, there are countless acts of compassion and human connection.
It's a beautiful example of how we shouldn't let fear dictate our interactions with the world. Because for every person who might do us harm, there are many more who are capable of incredible kindness and empathy.
So how do we break free from this narrative trap? Emma suggests looking beyond murder, expanding the definition of true crime to encompass a wider range of injustices. Instead of fixating on individual acts of violence, what if we explore the systemic issues that contribute to crime and harm in our communities?
Imagine a true crime podcast that delves into the world of corporate crime, exposing the greed and corruption that often goes unpunished. Or a documentary that investigates the environmental devastation caused by reckless corporations, holding those responsible accountable for their actions.
It's about reclaiming the genre, using it as a tool to expose the systems of power that perpetuate harm, rather than just focusing on individual actors.
Exactly. It's about understanding the root causes of crime, not just the symptoms. And it's about recognizing that true crime, like any form of storytelling, has the power to shape our perceptions of the world. The question is, what kind of world do we want to create with the stories we tell?
That's such a profound question. And it's one that I think we all need to be asking ourselves, especially as we engage with this genre.
Absolutely. Because true crime can be a powerful tool for understanding the complexities of human behavior and the forces that shape our world. But it's up to us to use that tool responsibly, to be critical of the narratives we consume, and to demand more from the creators of this content.
So before we dive into some specific ways we can engage with true crime more responsibly, I want to hear from you. What are some of the things that drew you to this genre in the first place? What keeps you coming back for more? And has your relationship with true crime evolved over time?
That's a great question. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this as well, and we'll be exploring those questions further in the next part of our deep dive. It's interesting to think about how our own experiences shape our fascination with true crime. For some, it might be a way to process their own fears or anxieties, while for others, it might be a purely intellectual pursuit, like a way to kind of delve into the darker aspects of human psychology.
It's definitely a complex relationship, and I think it's something that a lot of us grapple with. But getting back to Emma's insights, I was particularly struck by her point about how true crime can sometimes feel like a substitute for real-world action. We listen to these stories, we get outraged, we maybe even feel a sense of justice when the perpetrator is caught. But then what? What do we actually do with that energy, with that knowledge?
It's easy to get caught up in the drama, the suspense, the feeling of being in the know, of solving the puzzle alongside the investigators. But sometimes I wonder if that focus on the individual case distracts us from the bigger picture, from the systemic issues that contribute to crime in the first place.
It's like we're treating the symptoms instead of addressing the root cause.
Exactly. And that's where I think true crime has the potential to evolve. Imagine if, instead of just focusing on the who, what, and when of a crime, we also explored the why. Why did this person commit this act? What were the social, economic, or psychological factors that contributed to their choices?
That would be so powerful. Because then it's not just about satisfying our curiosity or getting a thrill from the gruesome details. It's about understanding the complexities of human behavior, the factors that can lead someone down a dark path, and ultimately how we can prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place.
And it's about recognizing that we're all part of the system. We're not just passive observers. We have the power to influence change through our choices, our actions, and our voices.
This reminds me of something Emma said about how she found solace in watching Criminal Minds after her attack. It was a way for her to process her own trauma, to feel like she was gaining some control over her fear, but she also emphasized the importance of maintaining that separation between fiction and reality. We can enjoy the drama, the suspense, but we shouldn't let it dictate our worldview or our behavior.
It's a delicate balance, because on one hand, engaging with these stories can help us understand the dark side of human nature, the potential for violence that exists within us all. But it's crucial to remember that those fictional narratives are often heightened, exaggerated, and designed to elicit a specific emotional response.
So it's not about avoiding true crime altogether, but rather about approaching it with a critical eye, a healthy dose of skepticism, and an awareness of our own biases and vulnerability.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that true crime is not a monolithic genre. There's a spectrum, from the exploitative and sensationalized to the thoughtful and insightful. As consumers, it's up to us to discern the difference and to support the creators who are pushing the boundaries of the genre, who are asking the tough questions, and who are using their platform to advocate for positive change.
So, as we continue our deep dive, let's explore some of the ways we can engage with true crime more responsibly. What are some of the questions we should be asking ourselves as we listen to these stories? What are the red flags that might indicate a narrative is manipulating our emotions or distorting our perceptions of reality?
Those are excellent questions. And I think the first step is to be mindful of the source. Who's telling the story? What are their motivations? Are they presenting a balanced perspective or are they pushing a particular agenda?
Right. Because even with the best intentions, everyone have their own biases and perspectives, and those inevitably shape the way they tell a story. It's like that saying, there are three sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth. And with true crime, that truth can be especially elusive.
Absolutely. And it's also important to be aware of how the story is being framed. Is it focused solely on the gruesome details, the shock value? Or does it delve into the social and psychological factors that contributed to the crime? Does it explore the perpetrator's background, their motivations, in a way that seeks understanding, not just condemnation?
That's a really good point. Because it's easy to get caught up in the whodunit aspect, the thrill of the chase, that we forget about the real human beings involved.
And how does the story portray the victim? Is their humanity acknowledged? Are they treated with respect and dignity, or are they reduced to a mere plot device?
That's crucial. Because I think sometimes, in our eagerness to solve the mystery, to find the culprit, we lose sight of the fact that these are real people with real lives, not just characters in a story.
Exactly. And this is where the potential for exploitation becomes a real concern. When we turn tragedy into entertainment, when we profit from the suffering of others, we risk dehumanizing the victims and trivializing their experiences.
It's like we're turning their lives into a commodity, something to be consumed and then discarded.
And that's a dangerous path to go down. So, as consumers of true crime, I think it's important to ask ourselves, am I supporting a system that exploits tragedy for profit? Am I contributing to the voyeuristic spectacle that often surrounds these cases?
And speaking of voyeurism, Emma talked about the Gabby Petito case as a really disturbing example of how true crime can become this kind of online circus, with people obsessing over every detail of the victim's life and engaging in amateur sleuthing that often does more harm than good.
It's a heartbreaking illustration of how social media can amplify the worst aspects of this genre. It becomes less about seeking justice and more about feeding our own morbid curiosity, about being part of the online mob, about getting our 15 minutes of fame by claiming to have solved the case.
And in that frenzy, we forget about the real people who are grieving, who are traumatized, who are trying to make sense of this unimaginable loss.
It's a reminder that true crime, while it can be incredibly compelling, is ultimately just a form of entertainment. And it's important to keep that in mind as we engage with these stories.
So, in addition to being mindful of the source and the framing of the story, what are some other red flags we should be looking out for?
Well, one thing to be wary of is the use of fear-mongering tactics. Does the story prey on our anxieties, creating a sense of paranoia and distrust? Does it make us feel like the world is a dangerous place that we need to be constantly on guard?
You know, it's like those true crime shows that are basically just infomercials for home security systems. They make it seem like there's a boogeyman lurking behind every corner waiting to snatch you or your loved ones.
Exactly. It's about being aware of how the narrative is trying to manipulate our emotions. And speaking of manipulation, be wary of stories that promote simplistic solutions or easy answers. Real-life crime is complex and messy, and there are no quick fixes.
It's never as simple as lock your doors or don't talk to strangers. Those are important safety tips, but they don't address the underlying social and economic factors that contribute to crime.
Right. And if a story seems to be pushing a particular agenda or ideology, be critical. Does it present a balanced perspective, or is it cherry-picking facts to support a predetermined conclusion?
It's like that saying, if you're not careful, the news will tell you what to think instead of what to think about. And that applies to true crime as well. We need to engage with these stories critically, questioning assumptions and considering multiple perspectives.
Absolutely. It's about becoming an active participant in the storytelling process, not just a passive consumer.
So it sounds like responsible true crime consumption requires us to be informed, engaged, and most importantly, critical thinkers.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that our consumption choices have real-world consequences. The stories we choose to consume shape our perceptions, our beliefs, and ultimately our actions.
It's like we're voting with our attention. Every time we click on a podcast, watch a documentary, or read a book, we're sending a message about the kind of content we want to see more of.
And as consumers, we have the power to demand better, to support the creators who are telling stories that are not only entertaining, but also enlightening, compassionate, and ultimately conducive to creating a more just and equitable society.
So how do we find those creators? How do we navigate this vast landscape of true crime content and find the stories that are truly worth our time and attention?
That's a great question, and honestly, it can feel overwhelming sometimes, like trying to find a needle in a haystack. But I think it starts with being intentional about the kind of content we're seeking out.
Yeah, I agree. Are we looking for pure entertainment, a quick thrill, or are we seeking something more thought-provoking, something that challenges our assumptions and expands our understanding of the world?
And maybe it's a combination of both. It's okay to enjoy the suspense, the mystery, the whodunit aspect of true crime. But I think it's also important to be mindful of the impact those stories are having on us. Are they reinforcing harmful stereotypes? Are they feeding our anxieties? Or are they helping us see the world in a new light, with more empathy and understanding?
You know, one thing I always look for is a sense of balance. Does the story present multiple perspectives? Does it acknowledge the complexities of the situation, the gray areas, the fact that there are rarely easy answers when it comes to crime and human behavior? That's so important because it's easy to get sucked into a narrative that presents a very black and white view of the world where the good guys are always good and the bad guys are always bad. But real life is much more nuanced than that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to pay attention to the tone of the storytelling. Is it sensationalized,
Yeah.
exploitative, or is it respectful, compassionate, and ultimately humanizing?
And I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the difference between using true crime as a tool for understanding and using it as a source of cheap thrills.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the creators who are doing it right, who are using this genre responsibly and ethically, they're not afraid to ask the tough questions. They're not afraid to challenge the status quo, to
Yeah.
hold systems of power accountable, and to advocate for change.
And those are the stories that I think are truly worth seeking out, the ones that leave us not just entertained, but also informed, challenged, and maybe even a little bit changed.
You know, one of the most powerful things about true crime is its ability to humanize the victims. It allows us to see them as real people with real lives, with hopes and dreams and loved ones who are left to grieve their loss. And I think that's something that we often lose sight of in the midst of the investigation, the pursuit of
It's
justice.
so easy to get caught up in the puzzle, the mystery, that we forget about the human cost.
And that's why it's so important to find creators who are telling these stories with sensitivity and respect, who are honoring the memory of the victims while also seeking to understand the circumstances that led to their deaths.
And I think that's a good reminder for all of us as consumers of true crime. It's not just entertainment. These are real people's lives. And we have a responsibility to engage with these stories in a way that is thoughtful, compassionate, and ultimately humanizing.
And maybe, just maybe, by engaging with true crime in this more mindful way, we can start to shift the conversation from one of fear and fascination to one of empathy and understanding. Maybe we can start to see these tragedies not just as isolated incidents, but as opportunities to learn, to grow, and to work towards creating a safer and more just world for everyone.
That's a beautiful vision, and I think it's one worth striving for. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of true crime, I want to leave you with this thought. The next time you reach for that podcast, that documentary, or that book, take a moment to consider your intentions. What are you hoping to get out of this experience? And how can you ensure that your consumption choices align with your values and contribute to a more informed, compassionate, and ultimately more hopeful view of the world?
That's a powerful challenge, and one that I think we can all benefit from.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, and remember, the world is full of stories, both light and dark. Choose wisely which ones you let in.